Welcome to this episode of Ngā Kōrero Mō Te Wā Ki Te Heke Mai o Te Mataranga, Conversations on the Future of Education. Today's episode is titled Evidence is No Match for Ideology. I'm Derek Wenmoth, your host, and with me is Professor Gary Stager. Well, tēnā koe, Gary. It's so good to have you on this program, especially since it's been a number of years since we linked up in New Zealand. But look, there are a number of people who will be listening and watching this who perhaps don't know as much about your background. Do you want to just bring us up to date? What's your journey to where you are?
Sure, it's great to see you. Well, I've been working in education for the last 44 years, trying to help teachers make sense of a world in which there are these rich opportunities, not just to teach kids the things we've always wanted to teach them with greater efficiency or comprehension, but to create opportunities to learn and do in ways that were unimaginable before. And that often requires some form of computation. I pursued being a jazz musician until my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me. And I've learned a lot from being in the presence of some of the world's great musicians. I'm a licensed preschool through 8th grade teacher. I've taught everything from preschool through the doctoral level. My doctoral research was based on creating a alternative, project-based, interdisciplinary, multi-age learning environment inside a prison for teenagers where kids were able to work 5 hours a day on personally meaningful projects. They were aged 13 to 21. I created one of the first online master's degree programs at Pepperdine University back in the late 90s. And I've been one of the advocates for computational making. My partner and I, Sylvia Martinez, co-authored a book called Invent to Learn, Making Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom, which has been called the Bible of the Maker Movement in Schools and has been translated into 10 languages. And I've worked as a journalist and teacher educator and now book publisher as well. Spoken at conferences all over the world. So I've lots of rich experiences that are all in service of waking up every day and trying to make this the best 7 hours of some kid's life.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So, and I mean, you and I have probably got a similar length of history in this education process. And I remember in my own experience, one of my early big influences was Seymour Papert. And I know that he's a close friend of yours and you've worked a lot to try and keep his work in memory. All right, do you want to just share a bit about the influence that Seymour had on your thinking and your work?
Well, first, a little bit about Dr. Papert. Couple PhDs in mathematics, grew up in South Africa, was fighting apartheid in the late 40s and early 50s alongside people like Mandela, was such a dissident that he had to flee the country without a passport, found his way to Geneva, where he helped Piaget understand how children construct mathematical knowledge, got invited to MIT, where he was one of the founders of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory and was one of the fathers of the field. And went on to be the father of educational computing. And in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the vision of folks like Papert and his colleagues was that if you could understand children's thinking, you could teach a computer how to think. And if children were involved in teaching a computer to think, that they would understand their own thinking better. From the very earliest days, the vision of computing was always as a way of making things, not just computer programs, but making things in the real world have intelligence and interactivity, but also making theories and ideas. I met Papert for the first time in 1985 and had a relationship with him until his death in 2006. And my doctoral research was documenting his last institutional research project, which was this alternative school that we built inside a troubled prison for teens. There was a lot that was extraordinary about Papert. One of the things was he provided very clear visions of what the future could look like in a optimistic, learner-centered way. And then he described, how they might take place in schools, and he created some of the mechanisms for making that possible, like the Logo programming language and programmable Lego. But he was also not the least bit naive, and he very quickly in all of his writing also told you exactly how the system was going to reject those innovations, no matter how beneficial they were to kids or to mankind. So one of my pet projects over the last decade or so is that I maintain a website called The Daily Papert, where it's the unofficial archives of his written work and a lot of audio and video. We now have 200 pieces of of Papert collected. I know there are file cabinets full of work that were lost to history that no one will ever hear or read or see again. And it also reminds us that we not only stand on the shoulders of giants, but how temporal these powerful ideas are. And, I like to say that if you want to improve education, or probably if you want to improve the world, the first thing you can do is find a cure for amnesia. It's amazing how rapidly people forget, and how rapidly the sort of artifacts of those powerful ideas are disappearing. So
You
I've been working a lot behind the scenes. In the next couple of weeks, I'm going to announce some stuff. With the help of AI, there's going to be some really good tools available that I hope will allow scholars and practitioners to engage with Papert's work for decades to come.
we'll look forward to hearing more about that, Gary. I mean, in the conversation we are having just before our recording, we were talking about the contribution of people like Papa and the evidence that is stacked up about what works in education and what we know is effective in terms of kids learning. And you made the comment to me that evidence doesn't always stack up against ideology. It seems we're in a time, a particular age. You've got it in the US and other parts of the world. We certainly have it in here in New Zealand, where ideology seems to be taking over in terms of the direction, and it seems to be ignoring so much of this history, this rich history of evidence that we've got. What thoughts do you have for people who are looking for where we need to go and how we attempt to kind of work against some of these ideologies that we think are just so wrong?
Well, as I said to you, evidence is no match for ideology. When a school leader says to me, "If only we knew what to do," I say, "Swing by my house. I have a few thousand books I can lend you." I actually heard Bill Clinton say this once: every problem in education has been solved somewhere, and it's been written down. I think one of the keys to success is shameless self-promotion. I think those of us doing the work need to be showing people what it is that we do, and not closing our door and teach. There's a rise of pedagogical authoritarianism around the world that's rooted in this very Trumpian notion of "I alone can fix it." So we have things like explicit direct instruction, which is a delusionary form of cruelty that fails at first contact with an actual child. Um, Otherwise, couldn't possibly explain my 7-year-old granddaughter's postdoc in Disney princesses, or my 10-year-old grandson's encyclopedic knowledge of every sports statistic on the planet, and dinosaurs and jazz history and Joe Williams and Count Basie. And kids know stuff, and they're learning if they're awake. This notion that they need to be taught everything, like I said, I think it's emblematic of the rise of authoritarianism around the globe, and I think it needs to be challenged. And when you say to folks who are telling you that the only way well, first of all, they're telling you there's a literacy crisis. And if you stipulate that that's the case, which I'm not willing to do, but okay, let's stipulate that that's the case. Um, they start talking about how every kid has to be taught 43 sounds in a specific sequence. Just like everything else now, every kid should learn X in Y sequence at Z pace. This is lunacy. And when you ask, did you learn to read that way? Did your children learn to read that way? They'll sigh and they'll say, well, no. But we love our children, and our children have books. And somehow the policy recommendation never seems to be get the kids books and love them, and surround them with people who love reading and want to be in the company of nutty kids. This is just insanity, and it's mean spirited, and it disrespects children. I mean, we could talk about what it does to teachers when we hand them a script and make them cogs in some sort of wheel, some system that they have no agency over. But the idea that children are empty vessels or are completely incompetent is profoundly ridiculous. And we could just hold the mirror up to their other concerns. They want to yank screens out of kids' hands because of all the things the kids have figured out how to do. While education policy is rooted in this deficit model of kids don't know nothing until we tell them, and then we invent all sorts of scientific cosplay and word salad to justify this stuff. If I see the word cognitive in a sentence or hear someone say it, I run in the other direction. All this pseudoscience, the next thing we measuring bumps on the head to explain, how gerbils are pulling pulleys and levers, and there's a Rube Goldberg machine in our heads that is finely attuned to whatever nonsense that the Ministry of Education is is propagating that week. If you spend any time in the company of children, you have to delight in the wonder of what they're capable of. And I want to live in a world where school is the place that kids wake up in the middle of the night with a burning desire to get back to continue working on something that matters to them, and where their teachers wake up every morning and ask how to make this the best day of a kid's life. And one of the ways we get there is by answering the question of how do you gain the greatest benefit from being co-located in the same space at the same time?
Right.
How do we take the greatest advantage of this gift of being together and having the opportunity to learn something, not in a group but as my colleagues in Reggio Emilia teach, as a group.
Right.
That and that's what sort of animates my work these days as well. And a large part of that is refocusing on the art of teaching, which I think has structurally been lost from the process.
I think that that point is one that's foregrounded in my thinking. And like you, I've been a techno optimist pretty much all my career. I've seen the great value in the sorts of things that you're talking about. I want to pick up on, though, one of the things that we are facing in New Zealand, as we're talking in other parts of the world, is this taking technology out of the classroom, taking it away out of the hands of the kids. And one of the primary drivers for that is the medical evidence that's showing a lot of things to do with addiction or kids being targeted inappropriately and so forth. And it seems that we've got kind of a conundrum on our hands here between doing something that's in the best interest and for the welfare of the kids, but also then addressing their learning needs in a way. How do you resolve that in your thinking?
Well, again, I learned from my incredibly wise and sane and deliberate colleagues in Reggio Emilia that it's irresponsible to build pens around children. We should find ways to constructively involve them in their world, engage them in their world, constructively engage them in their world. Look, if a cell phone is a problem in your classroom, we've settled this issue everywhere else in society. When you get on an airplane or into a concert hall or a movie theater, there's a social sanction for it. Um, but the deprivation is problematic, and no one's thinking about the unintended consequences or the fact that it's ultimately a tax on poor children. Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm going to go there. Rich independent schools can use we banned or confiscated cell phones as a cheap marketing ploy, because their kids also have a tablet and a laptop and a burner phone. One of the schools I worked with in Australia more than 30 years ago, helping them, embrace project-based learning and Papert's constructionism and programming across the curriculum. And we took their teachers on a retreat where they could experience what it's like to learn with constructive technology. And they last year started presenting papers and issuing glossy brochures and slick videos marketing their school as being the first school that manufactured their own dumb phone that they require all the parents to buy for their children. That's, of course, school branded. It has their
Yeah.
royal crest on it. And this isn't an educational innovation. This is a marketing ploy, and that's cool. Like I'm good with marketing. But then this gets conflated into to national policy or worse, legislation, which is impossible to reverse. And you get this ham-fisted approach, which instead of dealing with being a good citizen, you make it impossible for kids to see an expert teach them how to do something
Hmm.
on the device in their pocket, or the 13 times a day that I point my phone at something now and ask about what I'm looking at. And it gives me a depth of information and access to knowledge that was unimaginable even just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Um, I just ask I just look at all this madness from the position of what would make you how would it even occur to you to deprive kids of these opportunities? I wonder if it's illegal for my granddaughter to text me, and I know what that means to me to be able to engage in a conversation with her, or when my grandson spontaneously starts composing a piece of music in GarageBand and sends it to me, and then I make suggestions for him about how to improve it. And um, and again, coming back to the sort of explicit instruction, that when I say to him, could you make it sound more like bassy? He knows what that means.
Right.
And then we run into a wall, which is, it turns out if you're 10 years old and you're interested in music composition, there's not a lot of resources available for you. So I'm a lot more interested in, how come no one's written a music composition book for 10-year-olds?
Right.
Or what would that course of study look like, as opposed to depriving them of these opportunities? And, whether it's, I've got a million and one examples, but I was sitting in another piazza in Bologna last year in front of a statue for someone named Minghetti. And I watched a professional tour group, Derek, walk through the square, stand in front of the statue, and say, "This square is named for a very important person," and then keep walking.
No.
And so the idea that we're going to lose critical thinking skills is hysterical to me,
Yeah.
because when did we start valuing them in the first place? How is there so little sense of creativity or curiosity that you lead people for money to a place named for someone, and you're going to stand in front of their statue, and it's never occurred to you to even find out who they are or why there's a square named for them? In anywhere we live, there are streets named for people and monuments. And why aren't kids being encouraged on the way home from school to take their phones and find out about as many of them as possible,
Yeah.
and come back and report all the things that they learned? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the low level stuff. We could talk about all the computational power that they have, but we could also just talk about, it's immoral to be arbitrarily mean to children. And again, I'm going to come back to poor kids. This thing might be the only thing of value society has trusted them with. How dare you yank it out of their hands? If the phones are a problem in your classroom, put them away. One of my favorite moments ever working with schools was, I worked with, as you know, the first schools in the world where every kid had a laptop. And
Mhm.
I helped one of the first school districts in Canada embrace one-to-one computing about 25, 30 years ago. And they flew me up, and they had me in a room with all the teachers, and it was this, "Oh, great Yoda, may we ask you questions?" And someone put their hand up and said, um, "What do you do if the kids are playing games?" And I said, "Ask them to stop." And the superintendent of schools like fell out of his chair. He tells the story all the time. It was like the greatest moment of his career. But it's not that hard. Now, in full candor, when we did the work in the prison, every kid had a computer. This was 1999 to 2002. And we said to the kids, "Yeah, you can play games, between 2 and 3 o'clock. When you get your work done at the end of the day, if you want to play games." And these kids had suffered such deprivation by society, by being locked up. They had serious impulse control problems, some of them mental illness, that it became really, really difficult to control. And after 3 or 4 months of trying everything, we put them in a circle, and Seymour Papert said to them, "Guys, we really wanted you to be able to play games because they're your computers, but we just can't figure out a way to have this make sense. And so, we've erased all the games from the hard drives." And the kids went, "Okay," because we had built a level of trust with them, and they recognized that we said, "We have a dilemma," and they'd never seen an adult confess to a problem before.
Right.
And certainly they knew that Papper and some of us were kind of clever. And we just said, "Look, we tried, sorry, but the rule is, you can play any game you write.
Yep.
You can play any game you program, design. But the commercial stuff, yeah, we're going to have to get rid of it." I find myself in the unenviable position these days of defending computers in education when 99.6% of what's done with computers in schools is garbage, but the other 0.4% is absolutely vital
Mm.
and empowering, and amplifies human potential in ways that were unimaginable, not just years ago, but in some cases weeks ago. I'm of two minds on this. Sure, a lot of what my granddaughter watches on YouTube is garbage, but her sense of narrative is ridiculously rich. and she's getting that from somewhere. And I don't have a big problem with mindless entertainment. God knows I watched a few billion hours of it myself. There weren't congressional, hearings to ban Gilligan's Island, although there were about comic books and the erector set and radio and television, writ large at various times. There's been moral panics about all new media, but the alacrity with which bad ideas are becoming bad policy and worse, bad legislation is going to be very difficult to undo. What's the end? What's the end game? Do we really think we're gonna be able to sever kids from modernity forever? What happens when the functions of your iPhone are installed at birth?
What about the AI question, if I can come to that, Gary? Because
Yeah.
yeah, I know you've been writing a bit about that recently, and it's a big issue here, just like the laptops, just like the devices, where it's like fear is driving towards saying, let's not have that, let's ban it, let's wipe it out. What's going to be the role of AI as we're thinking about the future of education in your view?
Well, first of all, you have to have some sort of cohesive, coherent vision of education. The folks who are banning screens are going to let the most pernicious stuff back into the classrooms, the most expensive, the least empowering, the most surveilling. Well, they won't be called screens, they'll be called displays, and they won't be called computers, they'll be called tutoring systems.
Mhm.
And they won't cost $25 like a microbit, they'll cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But those folks are wired into the system and they sustain and amplify this system of content delivery being poured into children's heads, not you know without the friction of teachers getting in the way, right? So that vision's going to take care of itself. My vision is consistent with what I've always believed, that it's a way of making things. And again, going back to the artificial intelligence laboratory of MIT in the late 1960s, they said that computers are for children and computers are for making things. And Stephen Wolfram, arguably the world's most important mathematician and scientist alive, says that we now live in an era of computational X, that from archaeology or art history to zoology, there is or now will or soon will be a branch of that discipline that has the word computational in it, that not only represents the frontiers of that domain, but also probably the better paying version of it. And simple examples, low level examples, like if you've ever read anything by a great author about the writing process, or you've ever heard an author speak, the first piece of advice they're likely to dispense is, you're not as clever as you think you are. Everyone needs a good copy editor. And it's interesting that I use the word writing process because schools used to talk about the writing process. New Zealand had a really rich tradition of process writing. Well, AI is a hell of a good copy editor. The most outrageous thing that I like to say these days is I wouldn't accept a piece of student writing that was untouched by AI. More than 30 years ago, I told kids, never ask me how to spell a word or what does it mean. You have the means of answering that question for yourself. And the fact that I can turn anything I write into something slightly better, I think is a win. So that's the lowest level. On the higher level, the fact that I can solve problems and make things and create things that may only have an audience of one.
Mhm.
This idea of software for one is really powerful. That I'm going to be able to preserve Seymour Papert's written and oral and video legacy, hopefully for posterity, because I was able to use the AI tools to create WordPress plugins that are going to allow you to search anything he ever said, um, and find the citation and actually engage in conversation with the work, as well as share a quote daily on social media without me having to pour through tens of thousands of pages of documents. Um, I couldn't have done that 2 years ago without having a team of programmers that I could never possibly afford.
Mhm.
Um, my friend Brett Moeller teaches on the Gold Coast of Australia. I ran into him in Melbourne. He brought 3 dozen year 9 kids to Melbourne with him, on an excursion. And so the problem was, I got to keep track of the kids. I got to keep track of their medicines. I got to keep track of their dietary restrictions. So he wrote an app to do all of that on his phone. But then he thought, well, that's cute, but why can't I now um, direct message one or all of the kids? So he did that. And then he took the scavenger hunt that's part of the curriculum where they run around Melbourne learning things about the city, and he built that into the app, and it kept track of when kids got to some monument. They could upload a picture of it, or they could answer the question or give GPS coordinates. And then he thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if the app created a newsletter for the parents that told them about the scavenger hunt? So it said, Derek was in the lead until the Shrine of Remembrance, but then Gary overtook him by answering the following question. So it did all of that. And then he thought, well, tonight I'm going to let them run around the Chinatown area for dinner, but I want them to stay within its geographic boundaries. And Derek, I swear to God, I was with him at the Queen Vic Market when he took out his phone, and on his phone, he asked the chatbots, was this a feature he could implement? And could he draw a map with his finger of the geographic boundaries the kids were allowed to be within? And he pushed that out to all their devices so that if they left the boundary, it would alert them and him. This was millions of dollars of programming
No.
that no one needs but him. That enriched his his experience and that of the students in his charge immeasurably. And one last example, my friend Brian Silverman, who's a super genius, unsung hero of educational computing, he's had a hand in producing almost every version of Logo and programmable Lego and Scratch for the last 50 years. And in the late 80s, he wrote a piece of software called the Phantom Fish Tank. Now, it wasn't even software as much as it was a little book. It was a book about cellular automata experiments that he wanted to conduct. And he made a software tool for being able to conduct those experiments. And if you don't know what cellular automata is, it doesn't matter. The book sold, 6 copies, and the software ran on an Apple IIe. Maybe it ran on DOS. I don't even remember if it ran on MS-DOS. But there are scientists still citing it in their work. And Brian just did it as a hobby. He was kind of, he's the kind of guy who says casually in a bar when you haven't seen him in a year, did I tell you about the satellite we launched? And he means it. I asked him if he had a copy of the Phantom Fish Tank book.
Yeah.
The book that was about the software. And he sent me, a PDF of like running it through a photocopier. It was crooked, it had the brown edges, and you know what it looks like. And I thought, I wonder if I could recreate the software with the help of AI. And I uploaded the book to Claude Code, and I said, what are the chances that I could recreate this software in some form? 2 minutes later, I had the software. I had found source files for the either DOS or Apple II version that I thought if I got in a rut, in a pinch, I could upload this to Claude and see if it can make sense of the source code. It recreated the software. It recreated the software with a 2026 interface that no one could have imagined in 1987 when he wrote the thing. And then I said, hey, can you create a manual for this? And it wrote the manual for the new version of the old thing. This is, it's not only a mind-blowing party trick, but it also means that what was good is good, as my great jazz legend friend Jimmy Heath used to say, that this software would have been lost to the dustbin of history.
Yeah.
Had it not been for me having 15 minutes of time to waste and asking the question, hey, could I recreate this? Could I revive this? So I find it all really terribly exciting, but only not in a way of delivering instruction or of helping teachers automate chores that they shouldn't be doing in the first. Like I said earlier, opportunities to learn and do and make things that would have been impossible to learn or do or make otherwise.
Man, I could listen to your stories for ages. I wonder if you've got just a piece of advice to people who are listening or reading. You know, we're thinking about the future of education, we're thinking about the current milieu, which is tending towards explicit instruction, tending towards some of those things that you've said, and yet with the excitement of all the other things that you've just shared with us, what would be your sort of advice as they're facing just the next few months, but looking to the next few decades?
Well, Papert used to talk about the Monday someday conundrum. It's okay to worry about what you're going to do Monday as long as it points in the direction of what you hope to do someday. And that requires you to have a informed, consistent, coherent vision of what sort of world do you want to live in. And on the odd occasion that I've been able to hire teachers, the thing that jumps the CV to the top of the pile is worked at a summer camp. And that's because those are the folks who didn't do it for the money. They did it because they like kids and they delight in their company, and share a childlike quality, but also because they're the folks who, when it rains for 4 straight days, can stay at a ping pong table with 28-year-olds and keep them engaged in some way. And um, I think we should slow down a little bit and take a deep breath. And um, the question we should always be able to ask is, what can they do? And from a curricular perspective, um, it's something I learned from Papert. What can they do with that? There was a moment early on in the prison project where Seymour said, "What are you thinking about doing with the kids next?" And I still had my, you know, teacher glasses on and my teacher hat, and I said, "Well, we're thinking about doing some geography." And he said, "And what can they do with that?" And I was sort of a little bit startled. And he said, "Oh, I didn't mean to, upset you. Um, what you do with the kids should have the reasonable likelihood of leading towards the construction of a deeper question or a larger theory. And otherwise, why do it?" And so, but that challenges scope and sequence. And we should, we should view education as growth. That's what Dewey said. And if you're trying to pull a system along, if you're in a leadership role, one of the things that Papert said was, every time the system said to us, "We understand, we should have done something more outrageous." And if you're trying to pull a cart with a rope, the rope has to be taught. Otherwise, no progress is made. So maybe we simultaneously, if we can figure out a way to do this, slow down, focus more, and take larger steps. Because we need to have a sense of urgency. The great educational author and civil rights hero of mine and friend, Jonathan Kozol, has been known to say, "You're only 7 once."
Hmm.
And every time we say mañana, or "we'll get to it," or "maybe next year," or "I don't care what that kid thinks," or "there's no time for that now," um, we miss a learning opportunity. And time is the scarcest resource in schools. I've been quoting Papert a lot, but what he used to say, "Don't save time, lose it." Um, we should, the best learning is associated with that sort of obsession where you're not staring at the clock to figure out when it's going to be over, where you have some relationship with materials or ideas or people that's nourishing and fulfilling, that's leading to endless questions and challenges and bugs to overcome. And so the best advice would be, read, watch some stuff, figure out a way for kids to spend as much time as possible in the company of interesting adults. Um, if you wanted it in one sentence, I think that increasingly the solution to all of society's ills is more band. The only reason I sent my kids to school was band. Everything else we had in the house. The pandemic proved that, right? I mean, we can do school badly online. A few of us can do it probably well online. But again, how do we gain greatest benefit from being co-located in the same space at the same time? It's things like band. It's things like instrumental music and drama and art. And again, you know, if we're concerned about evidence, we've got mountains of evidence supporting that stuff.
Hmm.
Every time, you know, my partner Sylvia always says, "Yeah, yeah, file that with the chess and art and kids shouldn't be going to school quite so early research that we so freely ignore while clinging desperately to a quest for evidence that's almost always has kids and teachers at the short end of the stick.
Gary, that's a fabulous, provocative way to end the conversation. I thank you very, very much for taking the time to chat with me, and hope perhaps we might speak again in the future. We'll finish there.
Anytime. Look forward to seeing you down the road.
Ka kite.